Thank you. Let me begin by indicating that there's a slight change in the title of my talk. It now, as I've written it, is if you don't understand the second product, you understand nothing about capital. I want to just start by mentioning the point that Janos made at the very beginning, which was that we need theory to understand where we are now. And I agree. I think that's a relatively uncontroversial statement. Somewhat more controversial would be the corollary, a corollary that I would suggest, which is that bad theory helps us understand where we are now. 150 years after the publication of Marx's Capital, it is long past time for revolutionaries to talk seriously about its limitations. Unfortunately, Marx has suffered a fate that he understood very well, the disciple problem. As he noted with respect to the disciples of Ricardo and Hegel, the disintegration of a theory begins when the point of departure is no longer reality, but the new theoretical form in which the master had sublimated it. Some inconsistencies in a theory, Marx noted, may originate with the master himself, for whom, quote, the science was not something received, but something in the process of becoming, close quote. However, crass empiricism, phrases in a scholastic way, and cunning argument, in Marx's words, are the result when the goal of the disciples is to demonstrate that the theory of the master is correct. Is it credible that unlike his present-day disciples, Marx today would be proclaiming triumphantly that history has proven that the theory he presented a century and a half ago is correct? On the contrary, rather than crass empiricism and cunning argument, would he not be studying what went wrong? I want to focus here upon a central problem in Capital, its one-sidedness, a subject I first explored over 30 years ago and which was the central theme in my book, Beyond Capital, Marx's Political Economy of the Working Class. As I concluded in that book, missing from Capital is the side of the worker. Missing is what Marx called in Capital the worker's own need for development. Missing is the worker who produces herself through her activity. Missing is what I call Marx's key link, human development and practice, and precisely because this theme, this side is missing, the whole presented in Capital is inherently flawed. Let us begin at the beginning, a beginning to be found in Hegel's phenomenology. Every activity in which people engage forms them. The outstanding achievement of the phenomenology, Marx announced, is that Hegel conceives the self-creation of man as a process. Thus, he continued, Hegel grasped real human beings as the outcome of man's own labor, close quote. Precisely because Marx understood this key link between practice and human development, he rejected the idea that we change people by changing circumstances for them. On the contrary, the concept of revolutionary practice articulated so clearly in the Theses on Feuerbach stresses that people change themselves through their own activity, through that, quote, coincidence of the changing of circumstances and human activity or self-change, close quote. And that insight is a red thread that runs throughout Marx's work. From his stress on the way struggles of workers against capital transform circumstances and men, expanding their capabilities and making them fit to create a new world, to his understanding that in the very act of producing, the, quote, producers change too, in that they bring out new qualities in themselves, develop themselves in production, transform themselves, develop new powers and new ideas, new modes of intercourse, new needs, and new language. All through that, Marx was aware that every human activity generates a double product. There are always two products of human activity, the change in circumstances and the change in human beings. Unfortunately, for many who have followed Marx in name and others who never pretended to do so, there is only one product, the change in circumstances, the change in the object of labor. The second product, the change in human beings, the change in the subject of labor, is ignored. The political effects of this blindness can be seen everywhere. In the countries of real socialism, where the absence of self-government and self-management produced a working class with neither the capacity nor the will to prevent the restoration of capitalism. In the Social Democrats, who, convinced that they are cleverer than capital, use the strength of the working class as a credible threat in their negotiations rather than as a force to be built, and who accordingly emerge from the most disgraceful defeats as immaculate as they were innocent. In the political parties of the left, which, rather than treating social movements as multiple sites for developing the capacities of the working class, view them as fertile ground for the recruitment of cadres for their disciplined phalanxes, and then celebrate in their solitary gatherings the distilled purity of their brands and their preparedness for the next October. But it is not only political practice, however, that has suffered from the eclipse of the second product. Without an understanding of the centrality of the key link between human development and human capacity, we are blind to the limitations of Marx's capital. In considering Marx's capital, it's essential to recognize that Marx analyzed capitalism as an organic system, as a system of reproduction in which the premises of capitalism were the results of the system itself. That, he stressed, is the character of every organic system. That's what Marx wanted to demonstrate in Capital, that the premises of capitalism as an organic system, capital and wage labor, were also its results. Thus, in chapter 23 of volume 1 of Capital, Marx summed up his exposition in the preceding chapters by explaining that capital is a system which it contains within itself the conditions for its own reproduction, one which, viewed as a connected whole and in the constant flux of its incessant renewal, is understood as a process of reproduction. To underline this point, he concluded the chapter by stressing that the capitalist process of production produces and reproduces the capital relation itself. On the one hand, the capitalist, on the other, the wage laborer. In short, by producing the essential premises of capitalism. But what does it mean to say that these premises are results? On the one hand, we see that in capitalism as an organic system, capital is the result of the exploitation of workers. In that organic system, capital comes from nowhere else. Marx had no patience with bourgeois economists who confused original sources of capital, such as savings, with the source of capital within capitalism. And we should not hesitate to correct Marxists who unfortunately fail to distinguish between the reproduction of capital within the system and the original or primitive formation of capital based on premises from outside the system. What is our understanding and critique of capitalism if we do not recognize that capital is the worker's own product turned against them? When Marx declared that capitalism produces and reproduces the capitalist, he was stressing that capital is a premise produced within the system itself. The other premise of capitalist production is the wage laborer. But it's essential to understand that in capitalism as an organic system, wage laborers do not drop from the sky, nor in a system of reproduction are they the result of other pre-capitalist systems. Rather, these wage laborers are people who have been produced within capitalist relations of production, and this second side, the human product of capitalist production, must be grasped. After all, workers are not only exploited within capitalist relations, they are also deformed. And if we forget this second product of capitalist production, as so many do, we will never understand why workers fail to rise up spontaneously when capital enters into one of its many crises. Accordingly, consider the nature of the workers produced by capital. While capital develops productive forces to achieve its perceived goal, the growth of capital, Marx pointed out that all means for the development of production under capitalism distort the worker into a fragment of a man, degrade him, and alienate him from the intellectual potentialities of the labor process. Marx explained that under capitalist relations there is the separation of the intellectual faculties of the production process from manual labor. Thinking and doing become hostile and separate, and every atom of freedom, both in bodily and intellectual activity, is lost. A particular person, type of person, is produced by capital. Producing within capitalist relations is what Marx called a process of complete emptying out, total alienation, the sacrifice of the human end in itself to an entirely external end. This is the other premise of capitalism as a system of reproduction, a particular person available to be exploited by capital. Under capitalist relations of production, the link between activity and human development is negative. Its product is the destruction of human capacity, both in bodily and intellectual activity. Is it likely that people produced within capitalism can spontaneously grasp the nature of this destructive system? On the contrary, workers produced by capital believe there is no alternative. Capital, Marx understood, tends to produce the working class it needs. Workers who treat capitalism as common sense. He explained this very clearly in Capital when he said, quote, "The advance of capitalist production develops a working class which by education, tradition, and habit looks upon the requirements of that mode of production as self-evident natural laws. The organization of the capitalist process of production, once it is fully developed, breaks down all resistance." That's right in Capital. And to this, he added, that capital's generation of a reserve army of the unemployed sets the seal on the domination of the capitalist over the worker. That constant generation of a relative surplus value, surplus population, means, he argues, that wages are, quote, confined with limits satisfactory to capitalist exploitation. And lastly, the social dependence of the worker on the capitalist, which is indispensable, is secured. Accordingly, Marx concluded in Capital that the capitalist can rely upon the worker's dependence upon capital, which springs from the conditions of production and is guaranteed in perpetuity by them. Guaranteed in perpetuity. The tendency, Marx is saying, in Capital, is to produce a working class that looks upon capital's requirements as self-evident natural laws. Capital's ability is to break down all resistance, and there's the perpetual production of the workers' social dependence upon capital. Those unequivocal passages are not aberrations or outliers that can be ignored, but they flow logically from the picture of the working class produced by capital. That prognosis, however it may correspond to concrete circumstances now, should come as a surprise only to those who have ignored Marx's analysis of the second product of capitalist production or have treated it as a mere footnote to the production of capital. Now, of course, these conclusions are not what we understand to be Marx's position. Did he not expect the working class to reject capitalism and to ensure its non-reproduction? Something essential must be missing from capital. Yes, capital produces a working class that looks upon capital's needs as self-evident common sense. However, there's something else that enters into the production of workers, and that something is missing in capital because workers are missing as subjects in capital. Of course, it is true that in his discussion of the struggle over the workday, Marx allows us to hear, quote, the voice of the worker which had been previously stifled, close quote. But that's the aberration in Marx's Capital. The protracted and more or less concealed civil war between the capitalist class and the working class over the workday is certainly not to be found when it comes to the determination of wages. On the contrary, the worker's voice is stifled when it comes to the issue of wages, not by the power of capital, but by assumption. The worker's point, in place of the worker as subject, in place of class struggle over wages, capital employs an assumption inherited from classical political economy that treats the worker as an instrument of production without a voice, indeed, as a more or less well-fed instrument of production. Consider the worker's wage. As Marx explained in Capital, since labor power is bought and sold as a commodity, its value is determined, as in the case of every other commodity, by the labor time necessary for its production, and consequently, also the reproduction of this specific article, close quote. Accordingly, as in the case of every other commodity, its value will fall with reductions in the labor time necessary for its production. In other words, with increases in productivity. Ricardo, who Marx credited as the first to formulate accurately the laws, the relations he elaborated in Capital, articulated this principle of the symmetry of labor power and other commodities clearly in his Principles of Political Economy. And in Marx's Poverty of Philosophy, Marx explained that Ricardo's symmetry between things and human beings was simply the facts in capitalism. I won't give you the quote of, well, I will give you the quote from Ricardo. Diminish the cost of production of hats, and their price will ultimately fall to the new natural price. Diminish the cost of subsistence of men by diminishing the natural price of food and clothing, by which life is suspended, and wages will ultimately fall. And Marx said, doubtless, Ricardo's language is as cynical as can be. To put the cost of manufacture of hats and the cost of maintenance of men on the same plane is to turn men into hats. But do not make an outcry at the cynicism of it. The cynicism is in the facts and not in the words which express the facts. So end of quote. What is the cost of subsistence of the workers that determine the value of labor power? And Marx said it can be resolved into the value of a definite quantity of the means of subsistence. And we can assume that quantity to be constant. Quote, the quantity of the means of subsistence required is given at any particular point in a particular society and can therefore be treated as a constant magnitude. But does it matter whether it was high or low? Marx said it doesn't matter. Whether you assume that workers' needs are high or low, completely irrelevant to the end result. The only thing of importance is that it be viewed as given and determinate. That was an assumption that Marx took from classical political economy. He took it from the physiocrats who made the strict necessary, the minimum of wages, the pivotal point of their theory, and Marx accordingly praised them as the true fathers of modern political economy. And he said, by treating the minimum of wages as a fixed and given magnitude, quote, the physiocrats transferred the inquiry into the origin of surplus value from the sphere of circulation into the sphere of direct production, and thereby laid the foundation for the analysis of capitalist production. And Marx continued, with that analysis of a constant set of necessities, a subsistence wage, which Adam Smith followed, and he said, like all economists worth speaking of, the physiocrats provided the foundation for what I've called the Ricardian default, the particular link between productivity and surplus value which underlies the explanation of relative surplus value. The argument is simple. If you assume that there is a given set of necessities, productivity increases for those use values mean less labor is required to produce the worker, and thus, quote, the value of labor power varies with the value of the means of subsistence. The effect of productivity increases, and similarly he said, and surplus value varies in the opposite direction, or same direction as productivity of labor. The effect of productivity increases upon surplus value was, of course, Marx's general explanation of the generation of the relative surplus value. And it's the basis for what he called capital's, quote, imminent drive and a constant tendency toward increasing the productivity of labor, close quote. However, the Ricardian default was also at the heart and core of Ricardo's falling rate of profit tendency, or more accurately, falling rate of surplus value. Because in that case, it moved in the opposite direction. The reduction in productivity as a result of diminishing returns in agriculture created an increase in necessary labor and thus reduced the foundation for surplus value or surplus labor. Both arguments have their foundation, the assumption of a given quantity of means of subsistence. And as a result of this assumption, in the one case, workers cannot gain by result of increases in productivity, and in the other case, they cannot lose as a result of increases and decreases in productivity. In both cases, it is only by assumption that capital alone benefits or loses. Shouldn't we wonder, though, about the importance of this premise of classical political economy about the symmetry, of the appropriateness of the symmetry of hats and men, and secondly, the effect of basing this discussion of relative surplus value on the classical assumption. How can we treat symmetrically the process of producing hats and labor power? The first is a vertically integrated process of production extending from primary products, which contingently may be interrupted by equivalent exchange of intermediate inputs. The second however, is a sequence containing A, the moment of production of articles of consumption, B, a moment of circulation in which money is exchanged for those articles of consumption, and C, a second moment of production in which those use values, as well as concrete, uncounted, invisible labor, are consumed in order to prepare labor power for exchange. By treating the two processes symmetrically, only the first of these moments is considered in the production of the worker. The production of the worker is seen as a footnote to the production of the consumption bundle. The worker disappeared and is represented by things. As labeled by a disciple of Ricardo, it is the production of commodities by commodities. What happens in the case of an increase in productivity? In the case of hats, an increase of productivity at any stage will disrupt the equivalence of embodied social labor and money and will lead to a fall in the value of hats. In the case of labor power, similarly, increased productivity in the production of articles of consumption leads directly to a reduction in their value. But what happens then? Diminish the cost of subsistence of men, and the immediate result is not a fall in the value of labor power. Rather, it is a rise in real wages. How then do we go from the fall in the value of articles of consumption to a fall in the value of labor power? Capital did so by assuming the premise inherited from classical political economy that the standard of necessity is a constant magnitude. However, by accepting the Ricardian default, Marx brought with him the baggage of classical political economy, in particular, the treatment of money as a veil. Yes, okay. Abstracting from money allowed him to move directly from productivity gains to increased surplus value. But it also abstracts from the moment of circulation in which workers purchase the use values they want, and thus it obscures the specific characteristics of a wage laborer. In particular, it obscures the difference between a wage laborer and an article of and an instrument of production or a slave. The slave, Marx explained in his discussion in the results of the immediate process of production, receives the means of subsistence he requires, which are, quote, fixed both in kind and quantity, i.e. he receives use value, close quote. In contrast, he continues, the wage laborer receives means of subsistence in the shape of money, and it is the worker himself, quote, who converts the money into whatever use values he desires. It is he who buys commodities as he wishes, and as the owner of money, as the buyer of goods, he stands in precisely the same relationship to the seller of goods as any other buyer, close quote. In other words, rather than the product of a fixed set of use values, the wage laborer here appears as a subject with money and with her own goals. Accordingly, if productivity changes lower the value of articles of consumption and thereby increase the real value of the quantity of money that workers possess, what will workers do? Will they choose to purchase more or different use values, or will they be indifferent? One would not ask this question of a slave. By accepting the classical assumption of the fixed set of use values, the discussion of relative surplus value and capital, rather than turning men into hats, turns wage laborers into slaves. Outside, however, the confines of his theoretical presentation of the concept of relative surplus value, Marx consistently stressed the ability of workers to expand their consumption of means of subsistence under the appropriate circumstances. In volume 3 of Capital, he says, if the means of subsistence were cheaper or money wages, he said the fixed character of workers' wages is mere illusion. If the means of subsistence were cheaper or money wages higher, the worker would buy more of them. And he made similar statements in volume 2 and volume 1. And not only did Marx insist that in practice there was not a fixed set of necessaries for workers, but he also explicitly recognized that rising productivity did not necessarily lead to the discussion of the concept of relative surplus value. In the 1861 to 1863 manuscripts, he sets out 3 cases. One case, which is the case followed in Capital, the fixed set of necessaries. And the second case, where productivity rises, but real wages also rise, but not as much. And he says, and then there's the third case, where productivity and the productivity and the standard of necessity rise at the same rate. And he says the worker, quote, continues to receive the same value or the objectification of same part of the working day as before. His real wage has risen, but as its value has remained constant. In contrast, he says, in the case of surplus value, there would be no change in surplus value, although this would represent, just as wages, a greater quantity of use values. So despite Marx's clear understanding that rising productivity could lead to increasing real wages and no relative surplus value at all, we see that his explanation of the concept of relative surplus value considered only the first case where workers were limited to a fixed set of use values. But one of the things I think that's important to recognize that Marx recognized that this assumption could not be held, and he constantly referred to his decision, his plan to remove this assumption, to remove the assumption of the fixity of wages, et cetera. And he argued, that this question of the rise or fall of the minimum would be considered under wage labor. He wrote to Engels saying that, to consider changes in the standard of necessity belongs altogether to the chapter treating of wage labor. In the 1861 to 63 manuscripts, he again talked about how this was something to be dealt with in the doctrine of the wages of labor, and and furthermore said that any question, anything other than the cheapening of means of subsistence, is not part of our task. It belongs to the theory of wages. And again, he came back to this in his discussion in the results of the immediate process of production. More quotes, I'll leave them out for now. I think the point is made. So the question is, we know that what Marx did, what are the implications of what he did? In Beyond Capital, the book I did, I explored several aspects of the question of the missing book. The one-sidedness of capital, one-sided categories like wealth and productive labor, the importance of the degree of separation of workers, the place of patriarchy and racism, the dimensions of class struggle, the worker state, etc. Here I want to focus particularly on the question of the missing second product. Recall the product of capital that Marx revealed in Capital. Those crippled human beings who look upon capital's needs as self-evident natural laws and upon whom capital can rely in perpetuity. Those people are entirely consistent with Marx's 1853 description of workers who are not engaged in the struggle over wages. Marx described those as, quote, apathetic, thoughtless, more or less well-fed instruments of production. And he said, the working class which did not engage in those struggles would be a heartbroken, a weak-minded, a worn-out, unresisting mass. And he made the same point in 1865. Workers who do not struggle over wages are degraded to one-level mass of broken wretches past salvation. In contrast, consider the worker as a subject, a person with their own needs who struggles to realize those needs. For success in their struggle to reduce the workday and lengthen intensity, and their struggle over high wages, for higher wages, in order to satisfy their needs, certainly workers must, to succeed, they must fight against their separation, their competition as sellers of labor power. As the General Council of the First International declared, what the lot of the laboring population would be if everything were left to isolated individual bargaining may be easily foreseen. The iron rule of supply and demand, if left unchecked, would speedily reduce the producers of all wealth to a starvation level. And workers, in short, must organize. And Marx made this point in Capital as well. He said the struggle over the workday proves that, quote, the isolated worker, the worker as free seller of his labor power, succumbs without resistance once capitalist production has reached a certain stage of maturity, close quote. Workers, in fact, succeed only in achieving their goals only to the extent that they're able to negate competition, only by infringing on the sacred law of supply and demand, and engaging in what Marx called planned cooperation. Indeed, in 1868, talking about the struggles of workers in New York over the 8-hour workday, Marx observed that, quote, all serious success of the proletariat depends upon an organization that unites and concentrates its forces, close quote. And he stressed as well the need to struggle against international competition of workers, quote, nothing but an international bond of the working classes can ever ensure their definitive triumph, close quote. Insofar as workers do struggle for themselves and break down the divisions among themselves, they are not simply the products of capital. Class struggle is a process of production, and that process is necessary, Marx told workers, quote, not only to bring about a change in society, but also to change yourselves and prepare yourselves for the exercise of political power, close quote. Human beings, as Hegel had observed, are the outcome of their own activity, and we may add, and no more so than workers who engage in struggle. Even though they lost the battle over the 10 hours bill, Engels argued, workers had changed significantly in the course of that struggle. And Engels said, quote, the working classes in this agitation found a mighty means to get acquainted with each other, to come to a knowledge of their social position and interests, to organize themselves and to know their strength. The working man who has passed through such an agitation is no longer the same as he was before, and the whole working class, after passing through it, is 100 times stronger, more enlightened, and better organized than it was at the outset, end of quote. So what happens then when capital faces this working class? What happens when it faces a working class no longer stifled by assumption, but rather one that has developed its capacity through its struggles? All other things equal, that unified and organized working class will be the beneficiary of productivity increases. To secure relative surplus value, capital must ensure that all other things are not equal. Capital must defeat the working class. As discussed in the book Beyond Capital, just as workers struggle to realize their own goals by combining, capital must divide workers. Divide the working class becomes the watchword. And every individual capitalist and the class as a whole knows that, quote, the workers' power of resistance declines with their dispersal, close quote. Encouraging antagonism between different groups of workers, Marx had the Irish and English workers in mind, is he called, quote, the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power, close quote. Making changes in the labor process, but which, rather than strengthening the capacities of workers and opening up the product of the world of productive drives and inclinations, suppresses these and separates the intellectual potentialities of the labor process from the worker, turning the relation of head and hand into a hostile antagonism. Introducing the machine not as an extension of the power of workers, but as their competitor, and thus as a weapon used against them. All these have the effect of increasing the degree of separation among workers, and the last in particular expands the competition of employed and unemployed that pushes money wages down. It is not the increase in productivity that reduces necessary labor. Rather, it is the extent to which workers are separated. It is the extent to which the reserve army of labor produced by the displacement of workers ensures that workers are not the beneficiaries of productivity gain. That question, however, Marx explicitly put aside into the book of wage labor, on wage labor, by choosing to assume the standard of necessity constant. And he said specifically, quote, insofar as machinery brings around a direct reduction of wages for the workers employed by it, in other words, for example, using the demand of those unemployed to force down the wages of those in employment, it is not part of our task to deal with this case. It belongs to the theory of wages. However, if we exclude the effect of machinery upon the supply and demand for labor, what prevents workers who have developed their capacities and organization from capturing the benefits of productivity increases through real wage gains? If productivity increases were to drop from the sky, what would ensure the generation of relative surplus value? From Marx's identification of productivity increases as the sole source of relative surplus value, there followed his inference that capital's immanent drive and a constant tendency is that of increasing the productivity of labor in order to cheapen commodities, and by cheapening commodities, to cheapen the worker himself, close quote. However, once we understand that productivity increases in themselves do not reduce necessary labor, we can see that, quote, the immanent drive and a constant tendency of capital is to divide and separate workers. Productive forces do not drop from the sky. They are never neutral, but they always reflect the particular relations within which they emerge. Within capitalism, the impulse to defeat workers is present in everything capital does. When it reorganizes the workplace or introduces new productive forces, its purpose is not efficiency as such, but embodies the need to defeat workers in order to increase surplus value. Given his conclusion that within the capitalist system, quote, all means for the development of production undergo a dialectical inversion so that they become means of domination and exploitation of the work of producers, quote, Marx certainly did not view productive forces produced under capitalism which degrade the workers as neutral. Generations of Marx's disciples, however, have been determined to prove in the tradition by crass empiricism, phrases in a scholastic way, and cunning argument that Marx got it right in Capital. For them, quote, the two whatevers, whatever is in Capital is right and whatever is not in Capital is wrong or trivial, are their starting point. And one of the many results has been the tendency to substitute autonomous development of the productive forces, the neutrality of technology, and deterministic and automatic objective laws, all conceptions characteristic of economism, as for the class struggle perspective of Marx. But the disciples themselves are not alone at fault. The roots of the problem can be found in the master himself, quote, for whom the science was not something received, but something in the process of becoming. After all, by having introduced workers as subjects in his discussion of the struggle over the workday, why did Marx's succeeding chapter on the concept of relative surplus value silence the voice of the worker? Why wasn't this chapter framed by the same, quote, antinomy of right against right, close quote, that struggle between collective capital and collective labor that produced the norm for the workday? Why, in short, wasn't the determination of the historical and moral elements in the standard of necessity explained explicitly by class struggle? The answer, I suggest, is that when it came to a discussion of the standard of necessity, Marx abandoned, or rather postponed, his critique of political economy. Rather, he accepted the premise of classical political economy, the assumption of that given minimum wage that underlies the Ricardian default. There can be no surprise, then, that the productive forces introduced in that discussion were treated as neutral. After all, they were for Ricardo. In that tradition, any increase in productive forces will have the same effect, to cheapen commodities, and by cheapening commodities, to cheapen the worker themselves. Let us be absolutely clear that the critique of the categories of classical political economy requires the demonstration that underlying those categories is class struggle. Well, I'll try and shorten this because much of this is coming back to the question of, we're dealing with the problem of time at this point. So many problems can be traced back to the problem, the question of the missing second product. Not only the second product produced by capital, but the second product produced by workers themselves in their struggles to secure their goals. Had Marx seriously considered in Volume 1 of Capital the side of workers, the struggle to satisfy their needs and the development of their capabilities and organization as a product of those struggles, he could not have accepted unquestionably the classical premise of the constant set of necessities. He could not have acquiesced in the classical symmetry of men in hats, and in particular could not have treated wage laborers theoretically as slaves dependent upon a constant set of use values. When we add the side of workers missing from capital, our understanding of the whole changes, and within that further developed whole, capital as a part within that larger whole takes on itself new sides. Part of that new side is something not explored in capital, which is the absolute need to divide and separate workers. So We see now that what alone drives beyond the tendency toward the reproduction of capitalist relations of production is not the deus ex machina of the falling rate of profit and crises so celebrated by Marx's disciples, but rather it is the development of the capacities of the working class, capacities built in the course of struggle. So let me conclude then by quoting from the preface to the second edition of Beyond Capital. Beyond Capital stresses the manner in which the worker's dependence upon capital within existing relations is reproduced under normal circumstances, and thus it points to the critical importance not only of that demystification of capital upon which Marx himself labored, but also the process of struggle by which workers produce themselves as subjects capable of changing their world. This essential point of the centrality of revolutionary practice for going beyond capital affords me the opportunity, this is still from that preface, the opportunity to close with the quotation from George Sand with which Marx concluded his Poverty of Philosophy. And in the context of capital's demonstrated tendency to destroy human beings and nature, the statement takes on now new added meaning. And that statement that he quoted from George Sand was, quote, "Until there are no more classes and class antagonism, the last word of social science will always be combat or death, bloody struggle or extinction. Thus the question is inexorably put." Close quote.